Hi, it's Jamie from Guildbrook Farm, and welcome to The Dirt. Today, I want to talk about our holistic approach to medicine. So think of The Dirt as a getting to know you session, and today I want to talk about our holistic approach to medicine and why we believe what we believe, and how that applies to different illnesses or sicknesses that may come up. Especially now, since we are coming to the end of fall and beginning winter, and of course that means cold and flu season. So I thought it might be a good topic to cover right now. Um, in order to tell you why we believe what we believe, I need to tell you the stories that happened to me that led me to make the decisions that I've made. Now, there are several stories that happened in quite around the same time period, so I'm going to kind of try and separate them as best as I can so that they make sense. But sit back and grab yourself a cup of coffee or tea, or in my case, dandelion chicory coffee, and I'm going to tell you some stories. So growing up, I grew up during the 70s and 80s, and it was the time of vaccines and antibiotics. I got sick a lot as a kid, and every time I got sick, of course, we were dosed with amoxicillin and given tons of vaccines, and I kind of and any pills too. Of course, we're always given pills, and you had a cough, you took cough medicine. You had a fever, you took Tylenol. There are really not a lot of natural remedies that we used growing up. So I took that with me as I grew up, and as I had kids. I was the first one in line to get my flu vaccine every year, and I always went to the doctor whenever I had colds, or if I had a cough or anything like that, Dimetapp or Sudafed when you had sinus issues or anything like that. None of that stuff really worked. I actually always felt worse, but I never knew of any alternatives out there. And it wasn't until I had my own kids that I started to change my philosophy on medicine quite a bit. So it all started when my oldest daughter was born. Now, for one reason or another, I was unable to breastfeed her, so I had to use formula. After about 5.5 months, she switched to a formula. And she had terrible reactions to the formula. She had extreme allergic reactions to the formula. She had extreme diarrhea, projectile vomiting. She had open sores on her bottom that ended up turning into like a staph infection. Really terrible wounds, because she just, every time she drank a bottle, it would just run right through her, come out the other end, and that caused sores on her bottom. We ended up, of course, going to doctors, pediatricians, and like most Western doctors, they took a Western approach, which was to put her on medicine. So she went on a medicine, Zantac, to help prevent reflux for the vomiting. They gave her medicine for her bottom to help with the sores, the open sores. And we ended up switching formulas to a very expensive formula called Nutramigen, into Alimentum and then Nutramigen, which I believe was somewhere in the $30 to $40 range for a little container. And even as I switched over to foods and whatnot, I started introducing little bits of food into her diet. She still remained very sick. She had fevers that ran really high, and of course the doctor said, give her Tylenol, make her feel comfortable. And I did. Eventually we got referred to gastroenterologists for her. She went to 2 different gastroenterologists, and the one did tests on her to see if anything was wrong. They couldn't find anything. They just recommended sticking with, the Nutramigen. We got sent to a nutritionist who told us to put butter on all of her food. And we only went to her once. And she actually went and had a surgery to test for celiac disease, but she was only 12 months old at that time, and they couldn't find anything. So she hadn't been introduced to food very, very much for it to do any damage, if at all. So they really didn't find anything there, and that was before they had the celiac testing that they do today. So I was getting quite frustrated. Probably the breaking point for me was when she went past 12 months, and they started to be very concerned about her reflux, and they wanted to monitor her reflux over a 24 to 48 hour period by sticking a tube up her throat, up her nose and down her throat, to measure the reflux levels. And I'm in there watching as they're doing this to her, and she's gagging and choking and sobbing and crying. I'm watching the nurse just jam this up her nose and down her throat 3 times, and I said, enough's enough. This kid has been tortured for like the past 13, 14 months, and this is not working. I went the route that everyone had recommended, and it just was not working. Now, in the meantime, while all this was going on, I'm doing research online, probably since a very young age, since my oldest daughter was a very young age, and all these incidences started happening. I started doing research online, getting on forums, finding out from other people if they experienced similar things, and I found this one woman who straight up told me that the same thing happened to her daughter, and what I needed to do was an elimination diet, that my daughter had food allergies. It could be from dairy, it could be from soy, it could be from any number of things, but that I needed to remove that from her diet and slowly introduce them one at a time to see what was triggering them. Now, I brought this up to my pediatricians, and they didn't recommend it, so of course I didn't do it. But once they tried to do the tubes down her throat and that wasn't working, that's when I said, I'm going to try this, because nothing else was working. Wouldn't you know it, I took out gluten, soy, and dairy from her diet, and no more reflux, no more diarrhea, no more eczema. That kid had no more issues after that. That was one of the biggest enlightening points that I had when it came to medicine. This was something that Western doctors weren't open to, or they weren't aware of, and it worked. And you have to understand that this was 12 years ago. This is before celiac disease has been as exposed as it is today. The second thing that happened was as I took those foods out of her diet, I took them out of mine as well, because it didn't make any sense for me to cook or make food for 2 different people. So and plus gluten can be quite contaminating depending on how you have it in your house. So it just made sense for me to take it out of my diet as well. Well, lo and behold, issues that I've had since I was a kid were all gone. Now, whether or not I have celiac disease or not, I don't know. I highly suspect it. But I can tell you for a fact that growing up, I had stomach issues. I had issues with weight. I had issues with sinuses and breathing. And probably, I'd say one thing that was really surprising is depression. I was highly depressed as a kid growing up, and as soon as I took gluten out of my diet, I was not depressed anymore. That was completely gone. And if you do any research on gluten today or celiac disease, you will find that there is a connection between gluten and depression. So that was like the second enlightenment period for me about medicine and food. So another thing that had happened was, growing up, I was raised with vaccines and antibiotics. So my kids, when they were born, I brought them in for their vaccines, and anytime they were sick, I gave them antibiotics as well, whatever the pediatrician had recommended, thinking that they know best. And what do I know about medicine, right? So one thing that happened was one of the vaccines that my daughter got, my older daughter, she was about 2 years old at the time, and she was talking really well. And she went in for her MMR vaccine, and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but this is the fact. This is what happened. I brought her in for her MMR vaccine, and within 24 hours she could not talk. She lost her speech for up to 6 months. It was after the first couple days that I was really concerned. I brought her to a doctor. Doctors didn't know what was wrong with her. And I ended up taking her to a naturopath at that time. Now this naturopath is an MD, but she's also a naturopath and a homeopath. And we cleaned up her diet and took all preservatives out. She had a very, very clean vegan diet at that point, under the supervision of this doctor. And within 6 months, she was talking again. That's another thing that happened. I'm not going to go further into that right now, but that's another incident that happened. And then two other things. One other thing that happened is my kids both got the flu at one point. Now, when they got the flu, I brought them into the pediatrician. And at this time, there was this new medicine out, Tamiflu. And everybody was pushing the Tamiflu. It was this miracle drug to stop the flu within 2 to 3 days. So, of course, they gave it to my kids. And I took it as well, and so did my husband. And that was another incident where within 24 hours, my kids were, the oldest one was screaming her head off nonstop, and the youngest one was sitting in a corner banging her head against a wall for days. I'd try to pull her away from the wall, she'd go over to the wall and start banging her head against the wall. And did some research on that, and I find that, I don't know if the stories were true or not, but that apparently there were people who were getting Tamiflu in other parts in other parts of the world that were committing suicide after taking Tamiflu. That was the last time I gave my kids Tamiflu. And then finally, one other incident, which was really, really big, was when my oldest daughter was 6 months old, and I referred to this in a previous video about a life or death situation with my daughter. She got very sick. What she got was, she was 6 months old, she got rotavirus. It's a pretty common virus in kids, causes diarrhea. On top of everything else that was going on with her, she gets rotavirus. And she was under the supervision of a pediatrician. And it was towards the end of the week I had brought her in, and he said, keep fluids in her, just monitor her temperature, she ought to be all right. And this was Friday. He said, I'm not going to be on this weekend. There will be another on-call doctor on this weekend, but if you have any issues, just call into the office. So this kid, my 6-month-old, was projectile vomiting and diarrheaing at the same time, nonstop, for days. And Saturday morning, when I looked at her, she started to get emaciated. I was really concerned. And I called the pediatrician, and the pediatrician on call said, don't worry about it, she'll be fine. Just keep giving her fluids. This continued on Saturday night. I called the pediatrician. Don't worry about it, she'll be fine. Sunday morning, my daughter she was only 6 months old. She was very lightweight, very small baby to begin with, and somewhat underweight, especially with everything going on with her food allergies. So it's Sunday morning, and she is completely and totally emaciated. She's screaming. She's clearly very, very ill, very, very pale. And I called the doctor, and I'm explaining this all to her, and I said, you don't understand, she's very sick. I think I need to bring her into the emergency room. And I was told by that pediatrician that I would do more damage to my daughter by bringing her into the emergency room and having her hooked up to an IV than if I would keep her at home and keep fluids in her. I listened to her. Come Monday morning, I brought her into my regular pediatrician, who was in Monday. He immediately called ahead to the emergency room and had a pediatrician waiting for me at the emergency room because my daughter was in such bad shape. She ended up being in the hospital for well over a week, and while we were there, they said that her potassium levels were through the roof. Her potassium, I think it was her sodium levels as well, and that she almost died. And they said if her levels dropped very rapidly that she could potentially have brain damage. And it was during this period that her levels did drop very quickly, and they were doing brain tests on her to see if she had brain damage. Luckily she did not. But that was a hard lesson, that a mother's instinct goes a lot further than sometimes what doctors know or have learned in school. Now, when that doctor came up to visit us in the hospital, and the on-call pediatrician, the hospital pediatrician, was there in the same room as this doctor that told me not to come in. They were both in the same room, and she said, "I just don't understand. I don't understand what happened." And the hospital doctor said she was dehydrated. She needed to come in and get IVs. This was something where I went with what I thought was right based on skill, and I ignored myself, and I'm just very, very grateful that nothing worse happened to my kids. So, getting back to the naturopath that I went to, all these incidences basically changed my perspective on medicine and how to approach medicine. And while you might think that I might be anti-Western medicine, anti-vaccine, anti-antibiotics, I'm actually not. I think that everything has its rightful place. And I just think that all too often, the different practices of Western medicine and naturopath and homeopathy and some of the other Eastern medicines, when you get into acupuncture and stuff like that, they're all taken separately, and none of them are taken as a whole. And I think that is really the key when it comes to maintaining your health. I really think that there is the right place and the right time for every single one of these practices. So if I were to get into a car accident, break a bone, require major surgery, or if I had a really bad infection, I'm going to go to a Western doctor, and I'm going to be very, very grateful for that Western doctor. But for pretty much everything else, when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to everyday colds and flus, I'm going to rely more on naturopathy and homeopathy, because I think that those are better suited to treating those types of illnesses. So how does that play out in my everyday life? Well, and this goes back to my naturopath, because she really did she really helped guide me in changing the way that I approach medicine as well. And because she is an MD as well, she's not anti-Western medicine either. She knows that everything has its rightful place, but she really helped guide me in my thinking. So one of the things is, when it comes to something, say like a flu, you don't treat a flu with flu medicine or a vaccine. One of the things that we do is we treat it with homeopathy. I'll probably do a video on this at some time in the future for anybody who's interested in homeopathy, but flu is something that I would treat with a combination of homeopathy and naturopathy, which would be naturopathy being more like chicken soup, garlic, natural things to help ease your symptoms. Something like a fever. Now, in traditional Western medicine, if you get a fever, even if it's 100, 101, they recommend you take Tylenol and reduce that fever. What I learned is that fevers are the main defense against any bacteria or viruses. Your body temperature raises to kill off that virus or those bacteria. So when you suppress that fever, you're also allowing the bacteria or the viruses to grow. In a lot of cases, because antibiotics only treat bacterial infections, if you have a viral infection, that is the only way to get rid of that virus. So when it comes to fevers, I do not give Tylenol. I do not suppress the fever. I let the fever run, and I've let fevers run up under the guidance of a naturopath up to 104.5 without any intervention from medicine. When it starts getting very uncomfortable, absolutely bring in the Tylenol. If it gets concerning, bring them to the emergency room. That's my philosophy. But if most fevers are around 101, 102, 103, I don't give anything for it. Maybe cold compresses under the armpits, or in the legs or on the feet, behind the neck. But no, I do not give or take myself any kind of Tylenol or anything to suppress fevers. When it comes to coughs, same thing. A lot of times when you have a really bad cough, there's a reason for that cough. That cough is trying to get out bacteria or phlegm or the things that are in your chest. You need to get that out. When you suppress that with cough medicine, then all of a sudden that bacteria and all that gunk in your chest is allowed to grow. So again, I don't give expectorants. I don't take expectorants. I allow that. I actually encourage that if I can, to try and get that out. But overall, I would say probably the biggest thing that I do when it comes to health and wellness is naturopathy on a daily basis. I don't wait until I'm sick in order to start treating myself for any kind of disease or any kind of illness. So flu season coming, I'm not going to wait till I get the flu to start eating chicken noodle soup and taking ginger and eating garlic and some of these other natural remedies. I include that in my diet on a daily basis. Things like dandelion coffee, chicory, eating blueberries, things like that. I incorporate these into my diet on a daily basis so that it helps prevent any illnesses from happening in the first place. The old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. That is my philosophy when it comes to health and wellness. I try and do everything up front before I get sick, build up my immunity and my system all year long, so that when I am confronted with colds and viruses and whatnot, I have a better chance of fighting that off, if even getting them at all. And I can tell you that in the past 12 years in doing this, I hardly get sick at all anymore. And I can tell you that without a fact that it's based on how I eat, what I eat, and how I approach my medicine. So there you go, guys. That is my approach to health and wellness. Now, I am not a doctor. I am not a naturopath. I don't practice medicine, and I am not advising you to do or not to do anything. I am simply telling you what we do and why we do it, and that's just something that I'm sharing with you guys. If you guys also do anything with homeopathy or naturopathy or Western medicine or whatever your philosophy is, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments below. And if you have any questions or comments, again, I'm not here to give advice particularly on any kind of medicine, but if you have any advice that I can offer, or any questions that I can offer advice on, leave those below as well, and I'll try and do my best to answer them. So thank you guys for watching, and if you like this kind of stuff, like and subscribe. I'll probably do some more videos on some of the different ways that we incorporate health and wellness into our everyday lives, and how we approach different illnesses that might come up along the way. So if you like this kind of stuff, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. You want to be on camera too? Is that why you keep jumping out? Yeah? Or you go ham?